Delighted that you are here with us today, and we are so delighted to have with us Dr. Salimah Meghani, who is professor and term chair of palliative care at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. She's also co-lead of the PCRC Data Informatics and Statistics Core, and in that role, she leads the PCRC and has been leading the PCRC in establishing the first qualitative data repository in end-of-life palliative care. Dr. Meghani's program of research focuses on symptom science with a particular focus on ameliorating disparities. She served on several state and national committees on improving palliative care for seriously ill Americans and numerous Pennsylvania task forces to improve quality of life at the end of life. Dr. Meghani has also served on the member of the National Academy of Medicine Study Committee that authored the report, Dying in America, Improving Quality and Honoring Individual Preferences Near the End of Life. And to her mentees' benefit, she's also mentored numerous doctoral and postdoctoral fellows across disciplines and the spectrum of research designs and methods. We learn from Dr. Meghani every time we have her participate in any of our PCRC initiatives, and I know you will learn a lot from her today. Thank you, Salimah.
Oh, I was muted, but I was thanking Dr. Ritchie for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank all the participants who have joined the webinar. So I have three overarching purposes for this presentation. The first one is to bring the palliative care community up to date about a big milestone like Dr. Ritchie just mentioned, that PCRC has achieved, that is development of the first qualitative data repository in end-of-life palliative care. The second goal is for the larger palliative care community to share their qualitative. It's almost a pitch that I will try to make for the larger palliative care community to share their qualitative, multi, or mixed methods data to help us with the robust data repository that we intend to create as part of our PCRC data repository effort. And then finally, to try to deconstruct the process of data sharing and hopefully demonstrate to you all that data sharing, qualitative data sharing is manageable process, and we have a lot of support available through our PCRC data informatics and statistics core. So just to note that this presentation may be helpful to both researchers who have completed qualitative or mixed or multi-method studies and have shareable data, as well as those who are currently planning or conducting qualitative, multi, or mixed method studies. So you can anticipate some of the challenges and try to avert them at this stage. So I'll start off by talking about the general context and benefits of qualitative data sharing. I'll tell you about the evolution of the PCRC qualitative data repository initiative and where we are currently in that process. Then I'll talk about the process of preparing and sharing qualitative, multi, and mixed methods data as part of our repository. And I'll discuss some ethical issues in data sharing, hopefully to allay some of your anxiety in sharing your data, specifically talking about consent and HIPAA issues, as well as I'll present an example of consent language that you can either review your existing consent forms, or you can, if you're planning a study, you can incorporate some of that language in your consent documents. And then I'll finish off by talking about advantages of data sharing to primary investigators. So we probably all know that there are multiple levels of wastes that are avoidable in the production and reporting of research evidence. And it is estimated that about 85% of research dollars do not result in intended public health impact. I think this can be further extended to the waste stemming from lack of sharing of research data. And this lack of sharing is actually lopsided, because as you know that even though the general sharing of research data are low, there are amazing level of disparities in sharing of quantitative versus qualitative data. So this was a recent study that was published in Qualitative Social Work. And these researchers found that they only could identify 71 studies over 10 years that employed secondary analyses of qualitative data published in a wide range of peer-reviewed social and health-related literature. So I would argue that methodological bias is perhaps one of the largest sources of biases in shaping the field of palliative care. And I say this both because there is lopsidedness in sharing of qualitative data, but also this lopsidedness has implications for other types of designs, sharing of other types of designs, for example, mixed methods research, or the implementation, hybrid implementation types of designs as well. And this imbalance, I believe, is specifically important and noteworthy for the field of palliative care, because palliative care science fundamentally deals with human condition, which is personal, existential, spiritual, experiential. And these phenomena cannot be fully and meaningfully quantified. So to be responsive to this gap, the PCRC leadership realized the need for a qualitative data repository in end-of-life palliative care. And the vision for this repository was to accelerate science of end-of-life palliative care through sharing of through sharing and use of secondary qualitative data, qualitative, mixed, and multi-methods data, as well as to bring more methodological balance in shaping our body of knowledge to the benefits of our patients, families, and society. So these are some of the general benefits of sharing qualitative data. So data sharing is beneficial, obviously, for knowledge generation. There is no added cost of study administration and data collection. It maximizes output of research funded by public dollars as well as private sources. And it facilitates compliance with funding agencies with an increasing emphasis on data sharing and maximizing our limited resources. So just to provide a context, the PCRC requires all the PCRC grantees to share all qualitative and quantitative and all sorts of design-related data. Now, the benefits specific to end-of-life palliative care is that it maximizes impact of data. Patients and families contribute despite being in a very vulnerable stage in their lives. And it minimizes additional burden on research participants if a research question may be meaningfully addressed using secondary data analysis. So I'll talk briefly about the evolution of the PCRC qualitative data repository. It was proposed as part of the PCRC refinement and expansion, the U2C grant that is funded by NINR. And we started by first forming a qualitative advisory group with diverse expertise in qualitative methods that are listed here. And at the risk of overly simplifying the work that was involved, I would just say that we started off by forming the advisory committee, and we had several meetings of the committee. We reviewed the literature pertinent to qualitative data sharing, several correspondences, and survey of the advisory group members. And in that process, we also identified the resource intensiveness of developing a qualitative data repository. And we were looking for any natural partners that may be out there to collaborate on realizing our vision. During this process, we came to learn about a newly minted qualitative data repository, the first in the United States. And at the Maxwell School at Syracuse. And we started corresponding with them and learning about their repository and potential opportunities for collaboration. We had several meetings with the QDR, which is this repository, and the PCRC leadership, and then executive committees leadership discussions with NINR. And there was eventually formal agreement between PCRC and the Maxwell Schools QDR to host qualitative data in end-of-life palliative care. So just a little bit about the QDR at Maxwell, Syracuse. It is a highly resourced, as I mentioned, and the first qualitative data repository in the United States. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, RWJ, and the Sloan Foundation. And it is certified in the Core Trust Seal standards for trusted data repository. And this is an international standard, and there are, I think, about only a handful of repositories, and there are none in the United States for qualitative outside of QDR that we know of. I know that there are some initiatives going on in developing more qualitative data repositories, but it is certified every 3 years based on the Core Trust Seal. It is also a member of DataPass, and it assures continued access to data deposited in QDR. Should something happens to the QDR repository and it no longer exists, it has collaborative agreements with other repositories such as ICPSR and other repositories, and the data can be maintained for 25 years and also most likely indefinitely. So this is our landing page for the Palliative Care Research Cooperative Data Repository. As part of the QDR, the formal agreement, as I said, was signed. And this is our PCRC collection. And it acknowledges our funding sources. And we hope to change this data projects to hopefully a lot of data that we have already started to receive and will be receiving. So the access to QDR and our collection is available from the PCRC Data Informatics and Statistics core website. The first year of partnership will allow unlimited number of submissions, and it has been further extended due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And subsequently, there will be a fee based on 5, 10, or 20 deposits. And there are no fees to the investigators. And this is an important point because the fee for depositing data, the typical fee ranges between $300 to $2,000 with QDR. So noting that there are no fees to the investigators for depositing or using the data. So more in terms of the nuts and bolts of what you need to do to share data and how can you share data. So if you have qualitative, it's a mouthful to say it every time, but if you have qualitative multi-methods or mixed methods data, you can deposit, you can share your data with us. The size of an individual deposit does not matter. And we also welcome pilot and small scale studies. And you do not need to be a PCRC member to deposit or share your data. And that's also an important point to note. So we encourage you to start a new project. So if you are interested or have data that you would like to share, you can start with depositing. The form is available from our website. Actually, you complete a form and we receive a request. It's a very simple form. And then we send you the information about how to start the deposit process, which is also fairly simple. And you can start by uploading something that is de-identified, for example, your interview guide, just as an example. But you just have to start a process, and once you start the process, then you can request a consultation from QDR as well as from PCRC about any specific questions, and we can help you. So what kind of help is actually available to the investigators? So we can assist you with identifying which data you might share, how to organize data and prepare data for sharing. There is a detailed guide for de-identifying sensitive data and HIPAA related identifiers. Once you deposit the data, the QDR will check the documentation, the file formats, and help you select the appropriate access control. And I'll talk about the access control just in a bit. And then data are published once you approve it, and the deposits can be published under a week. So it can be a very expeditious process on part of PCRC and QDR if all the due diligence in terms of the documentation is available. PCRC and QDR inspects consent and data for de-identification before accepting transcripts for deposit. And the data that are included, in the consent form, it can be shared. So essentially saying that the original consent form should have language to allow sharing of de-identified transcripts. PCRC and QDR are not HIPAA entities, so all data must be stripped of 18 direct HIPAA identifiers. And I think all of us researchers know what those identifiers are. We cannot accept data that are voice prints or video, we cannot accept data that are either voice prints or videos because those are considered identifying, but we can accept text-based data. So even after stripping your data of the HIPAA identifiers, there may still be a concern about indirect identifiers. And the QDR allows 3 levels of access control to address additional privacy concerns, depending upon the sensitivity of the data. So the PCRC leadership has agreed that we will require special access control for all of our data deposits, and I'll talk about what those are. So the standard access is something that we will not consider at this stage because we are also piloting this effort. So we will allow for special access control, and there are 2 kinds. There is a conditional access, which is the investigators can specify what additional conditions the user of the data would need to fulfill in order to use the data. The second one is more stringent, and it requires that it requires actually direct approval from the primary researcher or investigator for using the deposited data. These are some of the examples of the qualitative documents that you can share. So it includes interview guide or interview or focus group transcripts, interview guides, the study protocol or detailed methodological notes, field notes, analytical memos, code lists, any previous publications, or any other documentation that may be useful for further contextualizing the findings, as well as the terms of use of engagement. So you can specify, for instance, and this goes back to the access control, the conditional access control, that the investigators may specify that they would like to be engaged in the subsequent analyses of the data. They can also list authorship conditions. So the conditional access control is your opportunity and way of specifying how you want your data to be used and to what extent you would want to be involved in subsequent use of your data. So what are the benefits of data sharing to the primary investigators? I think it allows for more visibility and impact of your work, including more citations and publications. Important other questions may be asked of your data that exceed your bandwidth or interest, collaboration and authorship with other scholars in the field. And I think it's also an important point that data sharing raises the bar for more transparency in research and enhances alignment with best practices in conducting and reporting studies, thus improving the field and patient care. So, so these are some guidance for completed studies. If you have completed studies that relate to those three methodologies, and if you have shareable data, you can inspect your consent form for language, allowing secondary use and sharing of data, and PCRC can help you with these assessments. And then we also would like information about the identification, and most textual data are manually de-identified at the level of transcription anyways. So you may want to check your data for de-identification. And then there is another tool available from the National Library of Medicine. It's called NLM Scrubber, which is a text de-identification tool. I have used it. I think it worked pretty well, but it did not strip the data of all the HIPAA identifiers, like some institutional names were left off. So it's useful just as a first pass, but it requires informed decision on part of the investigative team if this is the right tool or approach for your data. And these are some practical tips for de-identifying qualitative data, and this will be available as part of the slide deck. But there are detailed guidance available to the investigators about de-identification and other documentation. So continuing with data sharing for completed studies. So I talked about data sharing that pertain to de-identified textual transcripts data. But if if your consent language is ambiguous and you think that you didn't have broad enough language for sharing the data, the QDR accepts data in aggregate, de-identified form. And I think that it's questionable what would be the application of those data, but I can think of few applications of aggregate de-identified data being deposited. And this would be allowed by most consent forms because we include in our consent forms sharing of aggregate data, de-identified aggregate data. So if you would like to, if you have questions about your consent language or have ambiguous language, then, and if you're willing to share aggregate data, we can accept a table with themes, sub-themes, definitions for sub-themes, and sample excerpts for the sub-themes. And this is about either studies that are in planning or studies that are ongoing. So I think it's a great idea to allocate resources in the primary grant budget, the dollar amount as well as support for a research assistant for manual de-identification of data as well as to assist with the deposit process. I think that this is not done correctly or not done as much. And this could be one way of building data sharing as part of your original grant. Also to meticulously manage and keep all the documentation, including the memos, notes, any methodological decisions, definitions of codes, interview guides, etc. And then document rules for description of the de-identification process. And this could be very helpful to understand the context of the study and how the data were de-identified, and are those helpful for your question and context. And then checking your consent form, and I cannot underscore this point enough because we are facing some challenges with the consent language for the data that we are currently reviewing for accepting in our data repository. So checking your consent form to ensure that the language allows secondary use of data. So components of good consent language, there are 4. What data will be shared, with whom it will be shared, where will data be stored, and how long the data will be stored. So this is just PCRC required consent language as an example. So it talks about what will be shared, and rather than using just data, which could be not understandable what that means, we recommend that you talk about transcripts of our conversations, if that is the type of data you're talking about. So to have more meaning for the participant. Then we are talking about where the data will be stored. And we're talking specifically about PCRC QDR at Syracuse University. How long the data will be stored, and we are saying that the data should be stored indefinitely. And then with whom the data will be shared, it clearly specifies that it will be shared with other investigators for future research. If you don't know from the get-go, which I don't think, usually if you're submitting an NIH grant, you are required to provide a very precise plan for data sharing, and you can include this language even if you're not one of the PCRC grantees. And if you don't know where you will store the data, if that is the case, then you can still talk about what data will be shared, with whom it will be shared, and how long it will be retained. And then a word about sharing of multi or mixed methods data. I know that I've been talking about qualitative data. So if you have multi or mixed methods data, the quantitative part of the data are deposited in the PCRC de-identified data repository. And this is a long-standing PCRC data repository. And then the qualitative data will be stored in the PCRC QDR data repository. And these two data repositories can be linked for mixed analyses. So I'll just end with saying that our hope for the PCRC QDR is that it will be a sustainable product for the PCRC and its lasting legacy for accelerating end-of-life palliative care science, and by extension, improving the care of seriously ill patients. And we need your help in materializing this vision and to bring balance in end-of-life palliative care data use and sharing. This is my acknowledgement slide, a very important one because it does take a village, and it did take a village, and all of the individuals listed here have played key roles in materializing this data repository. And I've especially highlighted Riley Gillette and Dr. Sebastian Karcher from the QDR, and Riley is from our team, and they will be the most likely people that you'll be interfacing with as a first level with regard to your questions. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meghani. We have one question so far. Voice print was one of the HIPAA exclusion. Does that mean audio recording of the interviews cannot be deposited? I am analyzing data directly from audio recording without transcribing.
Yeah, that's a great question. The audio and the voice print and videos are considered identifiable data, and they will not be accepted. So the answer would be no if you if those are the if you don't have textual data based on those audios or videos.
Thank you. We'll just wait for a few more questions to pop in, maybe a minute for those fingers to finish typing.
Sure.
One attendee has raised their hand.
Sure.
Nazreen, did you have a question?
Yes, so this is Nasreen Lalani. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think this is a very good initiative for having a qualitative repository, because it's kind of, we don't see those kind of things in US. I'm a new investigator currently working at Purdue University, and I have a pilot grant which I'm doing in the rural areas of Indiana. It's just in the beginning process, and I have not started collecting the data. But I have the IRB approval. So my question would be, like, if I want to share the data on your repository, do I have to inform the IRB, like how the process goes on? And then how should I, like you told us about contacting you people to share the data, but if you can just explain
Sure.
a little bit in detail.
Yeah, thank you, Nasreen, for that question. Yes, if you already have a consent form, then if you are early on in your research, you can modify the consent language by submitting an amendment to the IRB. And you can decide if you would re-consent the participants, and if that is feasible, that is the ideal way to go. So you may want to re-consent the participants if that is possible. Also, even if you are in very early stages in conducting your research, there are consultations available as part of PCRC and QDR, and as part of our partnership with the QDR at Maxwell. Actually, we do encourage participants to reach out to us even at very initial stages for us to guide you to avoid some of those challenges later on. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. We also have Christian who has a question.
Great.
Hello, Dr. Meghani. Excellent talk. Thank you very much. I think this is really important. Our group at the University of Kansas has some great School of Nursing qualitative researchers, and we've already done some, but we are starting to do more. And I guess I'd love to hear from you and any other researchers that might have done this already. Just again, getting back to the IRB, I find that they're already pretty hesitant about interviews and end-of-life topics. And so I'm really worried about adding another layer of difficulty with the IRB and seeing that this would be shared with a wider group and indefinite and outside of the university. So just what does that look like in real life? How much convincing do I have to do at the IRB and have phone calls with them?
Not many, not much, to be very honest. Because I think that you have to have a great plan for de-identification of data, because what you're sharing are de-identified transcripts or textual data. So if the data are de-identified, so for instance, one of my mentees conducted a secondary analysis of a de-identified data set. And that data were approved by our IRB as exempt. So it's actually not that difficult if you can build in the right language as well as the process for de-identifying the qualitative data. And if these are audio recordings or videos, as the question was asked before, then we are not able to accept those data. So I think that it's more about about having that plan, and feel free to reach out to us to help with that language for the IRB, and do ask follow-up question if your question is not fully addressed.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think we will. I think one of the other researchers I work with is hopefully listening to this talk too.
Great.
Thank you. And I think Dr. Ronit Alk also has a question.
Hi, Dr. Meghani. Thank you so much. I have been doing qualitative research for many years, so I do have several ongoing studies, but a whole lot of completed studies. Part of the reality of our lives is that, at least I feel like I'm running on treadmills, 3 or 4 treadmills at the very same time, trying to catch up with all the deadlines and trying to be clear on what are the priorities that we have to meet and what deadlines first. And as much as I'd love to contribute to this, which is why I made the time to listen, and as much as I believe in what this is and the extreme amount of help, I'm trying to think of what resources would I have to use of my team who would have to spend the time putting this in, or talking, or going back to the IRB, or looking for the data. Well, the data is organized, but those kinds of things. It's sort of one big project, and yet how do we know how to prioritize or where to prioritize it? Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. L, for that great question. And I think that's the meat and potatoes of the challenge of submitting. It's not unlike the quantitative data that you readily strip the 18 HIPAA identifiers. This requires much more meticulous effort to really ensuring that there are no direct or indirect identifiers. Having said that, there are, for the completed studies, there I think requires some sort of an extraordinary commitment, and you know, so I don't know if there is an easy answer. I completely hear what you're saying, and I think that that's the main challenge for a lot of investigators. One way I thought about, and I don't know, you know, I'm happy to be challenged, is that if you have completed studies, if there are some, you know, I was thinking that I would use my discretionary funds to have, you know, an RA. I would put the RA on my IRB, and then, you know, let the RA do the work. But it does require some commitment on part of the investigators. Maybe starting off, I was talking to Dr. Sebastian Karcher from the QDR, and we have started to receive some data, and he did say that the data looked pretty good with regard to de-identifying, de-identification from the de-identification perspective. So maybe, because most data, as I said, we do de-identify them at the level of transcription. So maybe starting with checking the consent language and what de-identification has been done. Reaching out to us with, you know, your language, and we have been advising investigators about the language. And then for those who are planning to conduct a study, I think that this is why I broke my presentation up by completed studies and those who are planning. And I think those who are planning can probably build it as part of their budget, as well as have the consent language that is required for sharing. So I hope that probably addressed your question.
Salimah, I wonder if I could just add something to what you just said.
Sure.
I do think that qualitative and mixed methods research, especially as implementation science has also become mainstreamed, is really changing the landscape of expectations for qualitative data. And I think increasingly reviewers, study sections, the National Institutes of Health, and other funding organizations will begin to start expecting data sharing in the same way they expect data sharing for quantitative data. So part of this I see as part of a maturational change that we're seeing in our sort of larger research landscape. And as we do more and more hybrid studies, mixed methods approaches, then it will be critical for us to be looking at that qualitative data, or else we'll keep rediscovering things that actually have already been discovered but not shared because they weren't part of the initial analysis.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I think that's very well said. And I think most funding agencies do require qualitative data sharing. I think that researchers so far got away from that, basically because of not having the resources. Like the QDR initiative is fairly new in the United States. Our repository is completely new. So I think that in the study that I shared early on, there was they identified that researchers are asking secondary questions of their data, but most of those researchers are the primary investigators. So there is some of that being done with their own data. I think they found about 85% were those investigators who were the primary investigative team as well. But now that we have a resource available, I think it will become increasingly important to build that in your grants and then have a plan for sharing the data.
We have another question coming in through the chat. How old of data sets would be eligible for the PCRC QDR?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. And I don't think that we are putting any limits on how old the data ought to be. And the reason for that is we cannot predict what would be a potential application of the data. So for instance, somebody is doing a meta synthesis or some sort of a more inclusive understanding or an evolutionary understanding of a phenomenon. So there could be a number of applications for data that are dated. So we are not limiting by the datedness of the data, as well as, since the data will be kept indefinitely, it means that there could be potential applications for the data you deposit today, many, many years from now. So hopefully that addresses your question.
Thank you. We have another question, Siko Izumi.
Hi, thank you very much for this great presentation. I'm very excited about the qualitative data repository. My question is that the qualitative research data is really difficult to analyze because it has so much weight on the context. And sometimes it is difficult to analyzing it without understanding the entire context of how the data was collected. So do you have any idea, suggestion, what would be the potential use of those qualitative data? How much I can, thinking about using the those deposited data for secondary analysis, and what kind of analysis may be possible given that difficulty of interpreting the result findings using the context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a great question. And context is very important in qualitative data. So the types of questions, the types of questions that are amenable for secondary analyses of qualitative data is that you're asking a different question of the data that was not asked as part of the original investigation. So that's one application. You can look at a subset of the data and look at the themes and do some more detailed analyses with a subset of the data, depending upon. There is another application of triangulating your previously collected data with newer data that is being collected to see if the themes are consistent. So there are a number of different applications of an already collected qualitative data. The question about context is very important, and this is why I think I was talking about you want to keep meticulous record of the de-identification process. So you want to keep de-identification, like what processes were used to de-identify the data. You have your memos, for instance, or you have other sorts of documentation about what decisions were made at the time that you coded data in a certain way, you operationalized few things, and so all of that documentation is very important in qualitative data, and we expect that all of those data are provided. And going back to Christine's point, that this will be increasingly mandated by funding agencies, that you deposit qualitative data, and part of the territory of depositing qualitative data is to have contextual data available, like the memos, the field notes, the reflexive notes, etc., how decisions were made. So this is why I emphasize that the data management part for the studies that are either being planned or undergoing, that all of those are kept meticulously.
Thank you very much. Just one additional question. So is that possible to deposit the entire data sets in the software like the Atlas TI or the NVivo?
Are you talking about analyzing the data or sharing the data?
The sharing data, because
Yeah.
when I often use those software, and that is very well packaged, including the data and memos and those themes and process. So it is really useful as a whole package. But so I'm just curious: is it possible to deposit the entire software package as a data or the deposit?
I will need to check on that, but I'm sure that there is a way, because we have talked about exporting the code lists, etc. But that's a great question. Reach out to us, and we'll have a more definitive answer. But I would like to say that yes, there would be a way.
Will do. Thank you very much.
Great.
Great questions. For researchers working with naturalistic recorded data not converted to text for primary analysis, for example, home hospice visits with caregivers, patients, hospice IDT providers, will there be any support or funding for transcription? Is this something under consideration?
Another great question. Ideally, I think that as part of PCRC, if we have another cycle of funding, we can think about building those resources. Currently, I'm not familiar with those resources being available. I'm wondering if I have yet to come across a grant opportunity just for the transcription purpose, but that's a great idea for NIH, because there are these warehouses of a lot of qualitative data that Dr. Elk was talking about earlier. So you have humongous amounts of qualitative data that are sitting there and in need of some sort of resources for analysis. So for transcription and for de-identification, for depositing, etc. So I don't know that I have answers, but I have ideas.
Thank you. Excellent point. And what was the time period of a year without fee? If not too long, can we put the slide up about fees again?
Mm-hmm. The slide about fees, essentially, yes, I can definitely put that slide back. But basically, it just said that there's no fee to the investigators up until a certain amount of time. And I think we have until the July of next year, if I am remembering that correctly. But that's all. So the fee is based on the deposits. The depositees don't have to be concerned about, I should not have included the subsequent fee will be based on 5, 10, 20 deposits. That's for PCRC. So for the investigators, I think it is suffice to say that there'll be no fee to the investigators for depositing.
Excellent.
Up until obviously, up until I want to say July of next year.
Thank you. And for populations with lived experience of researcher misconduct, the request to share qualitative data, especially on sensitive subjects with unknown researchers, is ethically fraught. In your work, have you ever encountered any bioethical studies that have examined these issues? It seems to me that this literature is not already developed. It would behoove us as a community to develop in this area.
It's a great question, and I think that there are data that are sensitive, and data sharing is not for all projects. So obviously there would be projects and those data may not be shareable. But increasingly there is consensus that there is more consensus about, there's more agreement, I should say, about sharing versus not sharing the data, but definitely this field needs to be developed further. There are a number of articles already out there that discuss some of the challenges in sharing of data. Obviously, there are two schools of thoughts about sharing of qualitative data, and some researchers believe that you cannot, the context when you de-identify it becomes acontextual. I don't think that I necessarily buy that. I think that some data are not shareable, and some data are sensitive. Some data cannot be shared meaningfully with de-identification. For example, if it is a history-based research, then the subject and the participant is identity of that participant is the key. So there are data that are not amenable to be shared, but most of the data that we are seeing and the grants that PCRC grantees have, I mean, those data can be de-identified and shared. But completely in agreement with your point that this field needs to be developed further.
Great. And if we don't have any other questions, I'd like to move to the last slide.
Naomi, may I just clarify one thing? I realize that I may have miscommunicated. So the fee, there is no fee to the investigators for the life cycle of PCRC grants. So up until we have the PCRC funding, there will be no fee to the investigators. That may change, but right now there is no fee for the investigators. Subsequently, the PCRC will have to think about how would we deal with depositing the data if there is subsequently, because we are thinking about models. But there'll be no fee to the investigators for depositing the data as of now, and even when the COVID period ends.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you.
I see no other questions. I do want to thank everyone who's joined today, and special thanks to Dr. Meghani. If all of our attendees do go to our website, we have one more webinar in the very near future. Next up, we have Drs. Rebecca Aslakson and Corita Gertson to discuss multi-site trials, what I know now that I wish I had known then. We hope that you join us for that as well. We'll also be sending out an evaluation where we gather topics that you might be interested in learning more about. So please take a minute to fill that out. Thank you again to our panel and for all of our attendees for attending. Take care, everyone.